morning and welcome everybody. Thanks for turning out, even though we have great weather outside. It's nice that some of you found the way in here and think that the topic is interesting enough to be discussed, and I think that as well, especially just a few weeks, barely a week after the Paris negotiations. I think what we are discussing today is very relevant to the question of climate protection. I want to thank the organizers also, of course, in the name of Heinrich Foundation, of course, Green Thought Association, but also the Green Party here, and also my colleagues, for example, especially Meneksha, who organized a lot of these things. When we're starting our discussion now on degrowth, I thought a bit how we could get rolling, and I thought I'd take you back a few decades ago, or even a century ago, to 14th April in 1912, and I would guess that this is a date that most of you don't connect to climate change, to degrowth, which, of course, I mean, degrowth was not even a discussion back then, nor was the idea of having to say goodbye to growth or even rethinking dominant economic models. The 14th April 1912 is the day when the RMS Titanic collided with an iceberg in the Atlantic. And I think it's very relevant for our discussion today, because the Titanic back then was the biggest and most modern cruise ship in man-made history, and it was widely thought, due to the technological advancement built into the ship, that it was unsinkable. There are many reasons why the ship that day actually could sink and sank. Fuel summers, it was too fast, it was basically too big. If it would have been a little bit smaller, it could have probably skirted the iceberg. And also very much human hybris connected to this whole endeavor. The Titanic is a symbol for a time when the thought prevailed in Europe, also in the US, that technological advancement would always outsmart nature. And so dominant was the thought that even 40 minutes after the collision, many people on deck of the Titanic would already see that water was coming in the ship, refused to put on life vests because they thought that the ship would not sink. In the end, over 1,000 people died, and made this one of the biggest disasters in shipping history. And it still, I think, is a very important point. And when we jump a few decades into the future to 1972, when the at least now quite famous Club of Rome issued its very first report called The Limits of Growth, some of you might know it, which then predicted that if the way we live on this planet, if the way we run our economy continues as it was back then, we would, at least in the medium to long term, run into a disaster where habitats would disappear, where seas would no longer hold any fish, where the climate might change, and in the end, the world economy would collapse. And linking that to the Titanic, the interesting thing is that many critics back then said that the report was alarmist and the predictions would not come true, because exactly man-made technology would always find a way, again, to outsmart nature, and also find a way how technological advancement driven by the market economy would drive the economy to change in a way that these disasters would not happen. Now, some 40 years in the future, and we had a recent Club of Rome report, I think in 2012 or 2014, not quite sure, we see that the scenario painted in this report has not come true like one-to-one, but the predictions were pretty realistic. We we indeed see, and I think there are only few among us, or not only among us, but few among people dealing with economy and sustainability, who would argue that this scenario is not realistic, and that if we don't change the way we run this planet, not necessarily the way which I run the economy, that this will not have consequences, and very few would not argue that our lifestyle, as it is now, is sustainable. But the striking thing is, 100 years after the Titanic, more than 100 years after the Titanic sank, this notion that technological development, now named as green economy, can basically change this whole course we are taking, and that we don't actually have to change our lifestyle, we just have to twist just a little bit our development path in a way that technology, that the way that the economy, for example, is no longer run on fossil fuels but on renewables, that these things will be enough to avert disaster. And I also have to admit, within the Greens, this is also a discussion. We have two different ways of thought. One is the one advocating for degrowth, and the other one is the one advocating for a greening of the economy, but saying, look, growth is so fundamental for economic development, there is no way around it. We just have to have different growth. And I mean, it's also partly understandable where this idea comes from, and because we live on a planet where we have billions of people who live in massive poverty, and for whom the promise that, if not themselves, but at least the children will live in a better and more prosperous future, and who have so far benefited, like, to a very, very little extent from global growth, and they hope that this will change in the future, which I think is pretty justified. And I think this is a question that is also very dominant in Turkey, where a lot of people are not living in cozy environments, or not living in a life where you just work for 8 or 9 hours a day for at least a decent salary, but for whom the promise of being able to, I don't know, afford not a second or a third car, but like a first car, or being able to at least once a year have a decent vacation, is quite a promise, which of course is connected to economic growth. So when discussing degrowth today, we will have to face the challenge of not only explaining in which direction the economy should go, meaning not only explaining that, or not only steering the Titanic around the iceberg, or even better, probably to convince that it's not even necessary to build such a big and fast ship in the first place, but also finding a solution, explaining to people how, or not only explain to people, how people who were not on the ship before can at least find a place in this boat. And I think that's the challenge that we'll be discussing today, hopefully. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Welcome. Maybe you remember in 2013, as the Green Thought Foundation, we organized another conference on crazy projects. Is there anyone among us who attended that conference? Very few of you. By the way, that was a very good conference. Orestos is with us. We conducted it with the Greek Green Foundation. And there were around 300 participants, and the discussions were quite fruitful because we talked about degrowth. And the last panel was about a development-oriented agenda and green economy. And I met Bengi and and Fikret Edeman were among the panelists in that conference, but we had limited time. That's why we couldn't dwell into the subject in detail, but we understood that there was great interest on the topic of degrowth, and we promised to organize another event just to focus on degrowth. Well, it's been 2 years, but better late than never. For the past 2 years, maybe this is not the only topic we've been specifically working on, but we have been dealing with many other issues like climate, energy, fauna, etc. And whatever topic we're dealing with, we always try to insert the concept of degrowth, because we are aware that the problem is related to degrowth. And for us, it is important to have a critical perspective and a political stance about degrowth, and so that our solutions and our proposals will be sustainable and long-lasting. And also, Turkey is in a conflict area. Just next to us there is conflict, in our country there is conflict, and of course there are the political and social repercussions of that as well. In that regard, as the Green Thought Foundation, we have been always critical about the crazy projects, not only in terms of environment, but also in terms of justice as well. Of course, there are also social aspects like migration, job security, etc. And these crazy projects have many different aspects. I'm sure these panelists today will talk about the different aspects of these crazy projects, these mega projects. And I asked myself before coming here whether there is a degrowth movement in Turkey. In fact, we asked this question earlier on about the climate movement as well, whether there's a climate movement in Turkey. And last month, we organized a climate forum, and the motto was "For Climate." And we saw that we are getting organized about environment, about climate. Maybe these movements do not call themselves degrowth movements, but we have lots of common denominators among us, and we have to come together to identify procedures to work together maybe. Another topic I'd like to touch upon is, I'm sure the speakers will talk about this as well. For lunch break, we try to prepare you sandwiches from local farmers and organic farmers. And by the way, we will have a food forum as well, and you're all invited. Women are quite active in such movements, like the degrowth movement. But when we look at the conferences of this kind, we see that women panelists are quite few in number, or in the movements, women are not really prominent. But we have to benefit from this instinctive aspects of women, because at local level they are quite active, and the more we benefit from their local experiences and the more we bring their experiences to the macro level, I think our activities will be more successful. So I also would like to invite you to the food forum that will be organized tomorrow. I'm sure you will see the brochures outside. And I think these two topics are directly related, because we are going to focus on some organizations which try to organize local food production holdings to be cooperatives, etc. So you are also welcome tomorrow. Thank you very much for coming.